Hello, everyone, and welcome to 50 Years of Sleep and Dreams, a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the AASM. My name is Seema Khosla. I'm a pulmonologist and medical director of the North Dakota Center for Sleep in Fargo. Before I introduce our speakers today, I would like to remind you that your audio is muted and your video is off. We encourage you to include any questions on this topic or for the speakers in the Q&A on the Zoom platform. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with everyone who registered. Now, allow me to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Thomas Roth is the founder of the Sleep Disorders and Research Center at Henry Ford Health in Detroit, Michigan, and a professor emeritus at Wayne State University and the University of Michigan. He was the second president of the AASM, led the Sleep Research Society, and served as founding president of the National Sleep Foundation. He also chaired the NIH's Sleep Disorders Research Advisory Board. Dr. Stuart Kwan is the McGinnis Professor of Sleep Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is Professor Emeritus of Medicine at the University of Arizona. He is the founding editor of the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine and is a recipient of the AASM Excellence in Research Award and the Distinguished Leadership Award. He led the AASM as president in 1999 to 2000. Dr. Nancy Collip is the recently retired director of the Emory Sleep Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where she was also professor of medicine and neurology. She served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine for a decade and has chaired several AASM committees, task forces, and national initiatives shaping the field. She was the fourth female president of the AASM and led the organization from 2011 to 2012. Dr. Mary Carskadden and Dr. Mir Krieger were going to join us today, but due to travel changes, unfortunately, both are unable to join. They send along their regrets and well wishes. So let's begin. I think we all know that the field of sleep medicine started with Dr. Bill Dement, but Dr. Roth, how did that go from an idea to an actual field?
Well, Dr. Dement had a sleep clinic at Stanford University, and there are a couple of others which are sort of trying to start out. There was one at UCLA with Dr. Kales, and at that point, Dr. Dement felt that there was a need to get, a field started. And the first way to start that field, the first initiative was to get a society. So in 1975, I think there were 15 of us or 16 of us, and you can get a picture of that meeting actually on the ASM book, whatever it is, and so we met at the Chicago O'Hare Hilton. An amazing number of things have occurred in the society at the O'Hare Hilton. For those of you who don't know, actually, the discovery of REM sleep was at the University of Chicago, and so a lot of things happened. So we started with this idea of getting, starting what was then called the Association of Sleep Disorder Centers, and the purpose was, was very modest. Well, it was modest to begin with, in that we sort of felt that what we need clinics or centers, as we call them, and then we had to have a way to accredit these centers, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine started an accreditation process, and we sort of were talking. It's totally different than it is today. It was pretty much done at night, and it was volunteers, and you got dinner as your reward. It's very different. And then the other thing we needed was to accredit individuals, and we had what was then the polysomnography exam, which has now evolved into a medical board, and that was a long-term goal. So that we sort of thought was the first step. Then we sort of had to build on that. So we needed nosology, we needed a textbook, we needed a journal, and I think the other panel members can sort of talk about that. There are a lot of things we wanted, but we started with a society and a bunch of committees which looked at accreditation of individuals and accreditation of centers. And that was sort of the beginning of it all, and the development of an annual meeting, which we'll talk about at length, because it took quite a while before we got our first annual meeting.
So Dr. Kwan and Dr. Collip, we had conversation earlier about what it takes to make a field. How do you create a field from nothing? What is it that we need to do?
Yeah, well, obviously you have to have a body of knowledge to start. And I think after that, there was the idea that you have a nosology, so you define the different disorders in the field. And as Tom said, then once you have that, you can create maybe a certification or an exam, and then that moved and the accreditation of sleep centers too. So all that started to kind of group together, and then after the exam, and starting to get into how do you train people for the specialty, and so the AASM, as it's now known, back then started accreditation for fellowships, and and that all eventually moved into the current kind of accepted ACGME and American Medical Specialties.
So it's interesting, right? Because it kind of went with this idea from Dr. Dement and then this group of people that not only created the field, but then created this professional society, right? So do you need a professional society for every field? Is that who's responsible for the fellowship and the accreditation and training of clinicians?
Well, it's a first step. There's obviously a national training you have to be, and there's national boards and things like that. But they don't. But you have to show that you can do it before they accept it. So all of this
Uh,
fell to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine to sort of do this and then apply to the national boards and things like that. I have to point out that I was given the task of giving the first exam.
Tell us about
And
that.
but the thing that was really exciting about that is it's the only night I've ever had insomnia. The night before the exam, you got to remember who's taking the exam: Dr. Dement, Dr. Weitzman, Dr. Karajan. It was everybody, and I sort of, and my nightmare was that Dr. Dement fails, and so what's ever going to say? Dr. Dement doesn't know sleep? No, they're going to say this kid Roth, he's a moron. For the record, Dr. Dement got honors. The first year we gave honors, and he was amazing. And but that was my one night of insomnia. So I always have empathy for insomnia patients from that night.
Isn't that funny?
And Dr.
Yeah, can you
DeMint
imagine?
had the big certificate, right? You had the first signed certificate.
Yes, yeah, and we signed the certificate. It's really interesting. Is Dr. Dement signed his own because he was the president, and I
Yeah, I
think
think that's
that also is in the Academy archives.
And
I
it was
love.
called the Academy of Clinical Polysomnographers,
Yeah,
or ACP.
yeah, yeah.
Dr. Coliff, I have your signature on my old board certification on my wall in my office. So that's kind of funny. So then, Dr. Roth, you kind of talked about that meeting in Chicago. What were those first meetings like? Was it a standalone meeting?
Well, the meeting in Chicago was 1975. The Academy didn't have its own meeting until I believe it was either 1980 or 1981. But before that, we partnered with all the major sister societies. So we had a meeting in conjunction with the Academy of College Physicians, ACP. We had a meeting in conjunction with the American Academy of Neurology. We had a meeting in college with the ENT. So for 4 or 5 years, we had joint meetings with other societies. So they would have like a 3, 4 day meeting, then they'd have one day at the end, which collaborated with us. I
Mm.
think in 1981, I think it was 81 or 80, we had our first meeting in San Francisco. And that was the beginning. And then in 1985, we evolved into a joint meeting with the Sleep Research Society. That's
So
what
tell us about there was a sleep apnea meeting that happened in
well,
Oxford in the 80s. Tell us about that.
that was a funny meeting. I mean, there were a group of us who were invited to come to Oxford University to discuss sleep apnea because it turns out all the sleep apnea was in North America. And the people in Europe, especially London, especially England, Dr. Fleetham, they didn't believe this existed. I mean, literally, they sort of thought it was a Pickwick syndrome. It affects like 3 people, and so what are you doing? It was a fascinating meeting because obviously things have changed dramatically, and there've been lots of international meetings since apnea meetings since then. But at that point in time, there was a real sense that no, this is the North American phenomenon.
Why do you think that was?
Well, because, eh, like for example, we asked them, Like what happens, do you ever ask if a patient comes in sleepy? And they didn't really recognize sleepiness very much. And they sort of point that out and we sort of ask them, what happens if patients snore? And so we would never ask somebody if they snore. It's not polite. So there's sort of resistance to change. And that
And
was,
probably this cultural component too, right?
yeah,
That we don't want to appear rude and,
right, exactly.
invasive.
Right.
Yeah. You know what I've always kind of wondered is, we've heard these stories of Dr. Dement and we've heard about the lab in New York. And what I kind of wondered is, this was way before the internet. So how did sleep clinicians in New York know about what was happening in California? Was it phone calls, letters? How did that work?
Well, actually, my first meeting was the 10th meeting was 1970, the 10th anniversary of what is now the Sleep Research Society. And one of the things I remember very vividly is a young woman got her PhD from Columbia University, and her PhD was scientific communication, and she picked sleep because it was like 100 people, you can study it, and it wasn't complicated. And she did exactly what you were asking: is how do they communicate with each other? And she had a ton of data. It's a published paper at some point. It's in Science, and she presented it. And what it turns out, she pointed out that if all the people contacted Dr. Dement and Dr. Rechtschaffen as frequently as they said, they could have done no work at all. So there was all this, all these lines going everywhere, but the hubs were Chicago and Palo Alto. So yeah, you're right. It was all phone calls.
So then how did that work when you tried to submit papers? Could you collaborate, or like on a book chapter? How did that work? Or did every person do their own thing?
No, we collaborated. I mean, I think Dr. Bond and Dr. Cowell can sort of point that out. Before the internet, I mean, things were tough. When you submitted a grant, you submitted a paper. If you decided on page 4 there's a change, you had to type the whole thing over. So, you went through an RO, you went through a grant to the NIH, you maybe wrote 2, 3, if you're lucky, 3, you know, versions of it. Today, there's 100 versions of it because you can change anything. So it's all typewritten, carbon copies. The way the first sleep
That's
meeting
what
was.
CC stands for, carbon
Yeah.
copy.
Right. So one of the things we did in the first meeting, so so you wrote abstracts, okay? And there was a program chair, and he'd tell you there are 147 people coming, and it was your job to Xerox 147 copies, mail it to the program chair, and he put them all together and put them in a folder, and you get them and you get to the meeting.
Wow. So
Yeah.
very labor intensive.
Oh yeah. I mean, I remember we had the meeting in Cincinnati in 1975. We basically burned out a Xerox machine.
So, I imagine with a society that's growing and full of different people, I imagine there's some conflicts along the way. Dr. Kwan, Dr. Collip, what do you think are the greatest sources of tension? What were some of the greatest sources of tension along the way?
So there are always a tension between those of the people in the sleep field who are primarily clinicians, and we're treating things like sleep apnea, which was the biggest sleep disorder people treated, and those who are primarily researchers, some clinical researchers, some did animal research, and it was kind of like those people were in the SRS. And the way the Academy started, basically, you started with the Clinical Sleep Society, which is basically an appendage of the original organization, which was primarily for sectors. It was American Sleep Disorders Center. Then you had this Clinical Sleep Society, which was kind of appended on to accommodate clinicians. And the number of clinicians grew kind of exponentially, whereas there was much slower growth in the number of basic scientists in the sleep field. And so there was always this tension about, especially at meetings, what are you going to present at the meetings? Are you going to present kind of clinical stuff that would interest sleep clinicians, or were you going to present, basic science, which was primarily the sleep investigators? And in fact, at one point, there was an attempt actually to merge the SRS and the Academy together. This was down the line. This was when Dr. David White was the president. And there was a huge debate about whether this should come to pass. And it actually was kind of put to a vote in which it did not pass. And at that point forward, basically, these two organizations, collaborated, although the tension was still always a little bit there, but they went on their separate paths.
So the SRS came first, and then there was this clinical appendage that grew, and then ultimately became two sort of parallel, collaborative, but still a little bit of tension groups.
It's important to remember that the beginning of the academy was all SRS people. There were only 50 people. There were like 3,000 people what society they belonged to. So, there was one journal, one meeting, one everything. And then as apnea grew, as Dr. Kwan pointed out, apnea brought in a lot of people as straight clinicians and into research. And then there were people who started doing basic science, and there was a fight for, who gets what percent of the program, what percent of the journal, what percent of the profits. And so it was the development of two separate bodies. So there was the clinicians, the researchers, and the people who were both. And that's sort of what happened.
Dr. Collins, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's still even today a little bit of that.
Wondered.
APSS, right? Which is the sleep meeting is APSS. So it's the SRS and the AASM get together and come up with what the content of the meeting is. And I still think there's always this tension between how much basic science and how much clinical medicine is covered. But another tension I would say is, Stuart kind of hinted at it, was the whole sleep apnea piece, and just the fact that people in this field come from a variety of backgrounds. And so, the pulmonary people wanted to kind of own the sleep apnea, and the neurologists, the hypersomnia. And then, of course, the field really started in psychiatry, right? As far as I think the field of sleep medicine. And then there's always the ENT docs that have their surgery. So the tension is, I don't know if it's tension, but there's always a little bit of conflict about that. And each of those individual groups have their own society, and trying to see where sleep fits into those societies is also always a little bit interesting. And even when we get to the journal, even like, where are you going to publish your material? You can publish it in one of those journals, or you're going to publish it in a more sleep-centered journal.
Well, so there's conflict on multiple levels then. And maybe not conflict, but just sort of considerations.
But the way the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine was founded, the reason for its founding basically was the tension between the academy and the SRS in what could be published in sleep. There was the feeling among the academy membership, which was primarily clinicians at that point. Maybe it was 4 or 5 to 1 membership, which were clinicians. And, these individuals, if you had for example, a case report that was tremendously interesting, that would never be published in sleep. Or if you had this huge case series of something or some clinical trial, it'd be very difficult to put it in sleep. And so there was kind of this groundswell from the academy membership from the ground up, basically, that they needed a journal that was primarily directed at clinicians. And that was why the JCSM was formed.
Well, and isn't it lovely that we have the original editor and the most recent past editor of the JCSM on our panel? So let's talk about the journal. So you kind of alluded a little bit to why it started, or how did it start? Because there clearly was a need for clinical information, dissemination of information, case studies, and things like that. How did it start?
Well, basically, the feeling of the membership was voiced at various board meetings, and basically at one board meeting, it was decided that we should form a journal. And John Shepard, who was I believe he was president at that time, basically said that we need to form this journal, and it was decided that we should do it, and that the board would allocate a budget for this to happen. And then there was a debate about what to name the journal. And I remember this debate because various people put forth different types of names. I was personally in favor of basically the Annals of Sleep Medicine, I think, something like that. And other people felt that this should be something else. And John Shepard just said, I think it needs to be the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. And that was like the end of this discussion.
Well, it turned out to be a good name, didn't it?
And so the first edition, the first issue, it has this iconic black and white cover. And basically that was the idea of Dan Bisey. He decided that we were debating about what the color scheme was, and some journals were green, some journals were blue, that sort of stuff. And he says, black and white. And that's
Dr. Collins pointed out that the joint societies is now called APSS, Association of Professional Sleep Societies. Somebody pointed out in the question and answer period, the APSS was originally the name of the SRS. The SRS was formed in 1960, was the Association for the Psychophysiological Study of Sleep. That was the first sleep society, Association for the Psychophysiological Study of Sleep. And every year there would be debates about do we change the name because it's no longer psychophysiological, it's genetic, and it's electrophysiological, and it's endocrinological. So eventually we changed the name, but one of the great memories is somebody pointed out that there's no way in the world that people will ever go with it. So we changed it to Sleep Research Society. Although there was a major move to call it the Bill and Al's Club.
That may have been excellent. Dr. Roth, how has this field changed in your career?
Well, Dr. Collins and Dr. Korn, we're talking about, these tensions. And I think the reason you have tensions is because I think it always attests to the success of the society. If you have one child, there's not a lot of fights in the house. If you have two children, not so much. You have 17 kids, there's bound to be strife. We now have, 7,000 kids. And they all have different interests and have different tensions, and they have different kinds of things. So, so what happened is, as Dr. Kala pointed out, this is predominantly a bunch of psychiatrists. Harry Rothberg, Dr. Rothberg, who wrote the first nosology, was a psychiatrist. Dr. Weitzman, who was probably one of the two or three leading people in the field, the first vice president of the academy, was a neurologist. And then, then pulmonary people came in, and clearly there was a sense that they wanted the society to do this and that and that. How do you allocate a finite number of resources? So, I think what the society has done over the years is encompass more and more and more people. So there's dentists and, encompass surgeons, oral surgeons, ENT surgeons, and very clearly that's how it's grown. It's grown by incorporating different divisions and different initiatives.
So Dr. Kwan talked about how obstructive sleep apnea became this really strong part of our practice. What was it like before that? What kind of patients would you see?
Well, I think it was mostly the hypersomnias and some insomnia.
What about the urology referrals?
Oh, yeah. Well, you talk about that. I mean, when I moved from Cincinnati to Henry Ford Hospital, I was recruited by two departments. I was recruited by the Department of Pulmonary Division, Bill Conway, and I was recruited by the Urology Department. So in circa 1978, 1970, Dr. Karajan started it at UC Baylor. The way you diagnosed functional from organic impotence was in a sleep laboratory by determining whether you have erections during REM sleep. In our laboratory, it became so overwhelming, it got in the way of our clinical practice. So we only would do NPT studies over the weekend. It was huge. It was a very big deal.
And what do you think made that stop?
Oh, it just seemed like a silly way to spend a lot of money to make that distinction. People, people in England came out of England because they sort of don't like all this technology. There was a letter to Lancet sort of said, well, the way you do it is just put a roll of stamps around the penis, and if it's broken the next day, it's organic. If it's not, it's functional. So, there are easier ways to do it, it turns out.
Yeah, I was a medical student at the time, and I worked in Anthony Kales's lab, Hershey, and they used to do them, and I was like, I showed up and they were trained. It was like a little job, and I'm like, they do what? and you had to call the psychiatrist on call to come in and confirm things. So it was interesting.
I will admit, I thought it was a colossal joke the first time I heard it. I was like, somebody is pulling my leg. This can't be real.
It was used. It was really used.
It was definitely real.
And one of the tough things in labs was, today we just order all equipment. In those days, you had to build strain gauges for, to test this. You had to build. So a major job for somebody to build strain gauges for NPT studies.
I suppose.
Two strain gauges, right?
Okay.
So yeah, and again, like we were saying before, it's an expansion of the field.
Dr. Kwan, how has the field changed in your career?
Well, I think that when it first started, you had, as Tom and Nancy have said, you have people coming in from different directions, pulmonary, psychiatry, neurology, basic research. And initially, each of these groups had their own societies. And what these individual societies wanted basically was to claim their little portion of the sleep field for being in the pulmonary field. I know that, like the American Thoracic Society and American College of Chest Physicians, they wanted to claim sleep apnea and try to basically say that there really wasn't a field of sleep. And what I think was remarkable was that sleep basically weathered that, and so that it established itself as its own body of knowledge, and that people now are going into the field, and you can see this in our fellowship applications, that they're entering sleep fellowships without first necessarily being a pulmonary physician or a neurologist, and they're going from like internal medicine residency or family practice residency right into sleep medicine, rather than actually doing this other the training prior to starting a sleep medicine fellowship.
And I think patients are sometimes surprised when they learn that, it takes like 14 years after high school to kind of become like the sleep doc. Dr. Kala, what about you? How has it changed over your career?
So I think for me, since I'm so much younger than the other two,
Yeah.
you saw that recently retired person, not that young. But so for me, I really got involved in like the American Board of Sleep Medicine way back when. And that had more from the first exam that Tom gave, the ACP. And so I was at for several years and went to a lot of meetings with the American Board of Internal Medicine, the American Board of Medical Specialties. And then the other parallel path was I also was like in part of the accrediting fellowships as the AASM. So the AASM used to have a committee that would accredit fellowships. So we'd go do site visits just like you do for labs back then. And then the move was made to, try to bring that under ACGME. And that was thwarted multiple times before they the ABMS said, yes, we'll agree to do a sleep exam. And then the ACGME said, well, we don't want to be left behind because we want, the fellowships to be, it was back the other way around. The ACGME said, we'll accredit fellowships. And then ABMS said, oh, we don't want to be behind. We don't want the American Board of Sleep Medicine to be the accredited body. We want to be after the fellowships, the ACGME. So that was like, the two kind of big things that happened over the years that I kind of first got involved and moved on. And then what I would say more recently is just the number of people and companies that are involved in sleep. I mean, the interest has just skyrocketed in the last year. So there's just so much in the technology that I think has spurned a lot of interest in sleep. So I think a lot more people are interested in it now. Because of the health aspects. Even though we've been preaching it for years, it seems like more recently it's kind of gotten way more interesting to people.
Dr.
You
Kwan,
mentioned, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
you sort of mentioned the changes. My first meeting was in 1970. There was 99 men and 1 woman. So clearly there were no women in the field. And it sort of had to do with, recording people at night and things like that. Uh, a, a, a piece of sleep trivia is Dr. Kleitman, who sort of was the founder, ran the laboratory in Chicago, and he would not allow, and Dr. Dement was the main person doing the recordings, would not allow a woman there all night long. So the first woman recorded was Pat Dement after they were married.
Oh, wow.
There's a picture of that somewhere. I don't know where.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
Pat Dement was the first woman recorded in the sleep laboratory by her husband.
Wow. Dr. Kwan, you have a great story about applying to create a fellowship.
Oh, well, yeah. So when it was as Nancy has said, there was this great resistance to having basically, certification, official certification, and that sort of thing. And we basically, it was decided, Marvin Dunn, who was in kind of the running the ACGME at that point in time, he was finally convinced to go up to Mayo in Rochester and actually visit their sleep center there, and was suitably impressed that really sleep was actually something rather than just a rumor or this kind of novelty type of thing. So he basically suggested to Jerry Barrett and other leaders in the AASM that, gee, if we wrote a application for sleep fellowships to the ACGME, that it would be favorably treated, so to speak. So with that kind of assurance, we had a board meeting in, I believe it was Naples, Florida, where basically we all split into little groups. I remember working with Barb Phillips, and we kind of wrote the ACGME application and kind of turned it into the staff, and it got kind of tuned up a little bit before it actually got submitted. But that basically was sent to the ACGME, who then approved fellowships sponsored by the ACGME, which then lit a fire under the American Board of Medical Specialties.
Wow.
There was a lot of resistance in that. It was actually the ABIM. Again, a lot of the pulmonary groups were like, "No, you don't need your own exam." There was some pushback for sure, but like I said, once the ACGME said okay, then they kind of came in line.
I have to say,
I remember, I forget who the president of the ABIM was at the time.
Harry Kimball.
Harry Kimball. I believe we actually had him at meetings where he basically got up in front of a big group of sleep doctors and said, "You don't need an exam. You don't have a field." I mean, he basically just said it right to our faces.
wow.
And so that was those were interesting times to break through. And actually, we were actually the forefront of a wave of subsequent, new fields that basically were approved by the ABIM and other boards. And we were one of the first to actually have it where you had multiple boards being able to sponsor their diplomats to take the examination, and also to actually qualify and be trained as fellows. Before then, basically, I believe sports medicine was the only board.
Sports medicine, really?
It was family practice and internal medicine had a combined exam, and that was it. Now there's tons of them.
So another source of tension, I'm guessing, was probably around HSAT. So tell us the story. How did HSAT become an accepted part of our field?
Nance?
Well, there was a lot of angst about that for sure, because it was really felt that because in a specialty where it's mostly outpatient medicine, is, you have to have some kind of procedure. And so polysomnography was the procedure that kind of helped fund the field, I would say, to a certain extent. And so when HSAT came around, we called it portable monitoring back then, there were several attempts to try to get it to evaluate it. Matter of fact, one of the first committees that I was on, that I was the head of, was this tri-society meeting, tri-society, which ACCP, the American Thoracic Society, and AASM put together a paper that looked at whether portable monitoring was ready for prime time. And at that point, it was felt not to be. And so then, fast forward, some of the companies that made the devices started to really push and push. Of course, it was very well accepted in Europe. And so, there was a lot of push to get home sleep apnea testing approved. And so how it eventually happened was the ultimate decider was when Medicare decided, well, we're going to pay for it. And that was like in 2009. Prior to that, the AASM had kind of seen the writing on the wall and said, we need to, if this is going to happen, which we knew it was inevitable, we want to put together how it should. And so that was the second, the scope of criteria, that paper that came out right around that same time. And then it kind of pushed through, but there was a lot of pushback at meetings and what have you about using HST, and because people were afraid if HST came in polysomnography. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
now we know that hasn't happened, at least not to date, but that was the big fear.
And I guess I didn't realize that.
Stuart had some more than that too.
Yeah.
So I think on the board at that time, people don't like to, some of the membership may not realize this, but the board tries to acquiesce or try to do what they think, what is in the interest of the membership and what the membership wants. So you could realize that a lot of the members were basically owned sleep labs.
Right.
And so they're not interested in actually promoting home sleep testing, even though there was some considerable body of evidence to show that there was a role for this. And so the board is trying to accommodate basically its memberships, and that's principally why it was slower on the uptake perhaps than people in Europe and other places would like, which had adopted HSTs many years before we did.
I didn't realize there was so much lobbying by the companies to have their technology accepted. I think that's a piece that's maybe less visible.
That's a constant, actually, even today. That's a constant. Not being on the board, but I imagine that's a constant issue about how much support to give to various companies for their various devices to be accepted by insurance payers and that sort of thing.
So how did the ASM navigate that?
Well, we had a representative or two. We had a couple representatives to the CPT committee that decides whether to give codes to various devices, and essentially the board tried to weigh whether there was sufficient evidence and support to instruct our representatives to either support or not support proposals that were coming forth to do this. I would say for the most part, I think the board tries to look at the evidence and not basically reflect the wishes of manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's obvious now. Like, and back then, I will point out, Itamar developed this very unique home sleep apnea testing devices. It's called the WatchPad, right? And so the pulmonary guys were like, "Oh my gosh, how can you measure breathing without having an airflow sensor, right? And an effort sensor?" So there was a lot of pushback about that device. Of course, now it's probably one of the most popular devices that's out there. But it points out, like, as we moved along on this spectrum, now the number of home sleep apnea testing devices has exploded, and it's so hard to keep up with the technology because not only if you take one device, they're always trying to make their device better, right? To make it more user friendly, more accurate, etc. Well, each time you do that, you really should validate it. And then to Stuart's point, we're always trying to follow the evidence, and now you have 25 different home sleep apnea testing devices. I don't know, it's probably more than that. And each of those has to be validated. And so, like, the Scoper paper that published tried to accommodate what types of devices might, actually what was out there, what could be developed. But I think if you look at it now, it's not accurate, right? It's not able to capture all the different devices because there's so many of them.
And so many metrics, right? They don't all go into nice little boxes anymore.
It's interesting, the new iPhone came out. I mean, iWatch came out, and in their press release, one of the things they talk about, they are now better at identifying sleep apnea. So sleep apnea was in the release for the new iWatch.
Yeah. So
Samsung had that first, right? Yeah.
There's also several people from the Society, Academy, and SRS on the FDA panel, which evaluates whether these are reliable devices or not. You got to get FDA approval.
So, Dr. Roth, if you look into your crystal ball, where are we going to be in the next 50 years?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot more technology in terms of some of these devices. While the sleep laboratory is now necessary for complicated cases, I think that may be less and less and less as the technology gets better and better. And I think we'll have a lot more. I think the main thing that'll happen is people become more educated about sleep at younger ages. And I think, education is going to be the major push in the next several years.
How about you, Dr. Kwan? Where are we headed?
Well, I agree with Tom. I think that technology is going to basically make it much easier to make a diagnosis of, with respect to sleep apnea, for sure. And there may be technology coming on the field that will allow you to make have something to say about other things that we diagnose, like insomnia, restless legs, whatever. But where I think the sleep physician is going to be devoting most of their time is actually in treatment, because just like technology is evolving in diagnostics, technology is evolving in therapeutics as well. I mean, we've seen now you can watch TV and see the Inspire commercials, right? And I'm sure that there will be kind of different types of hypoglossal nerve stimulators that may work better for some patients than others. There was the press release by ApneaMed about their combination of pharmacologic treatment for sleep apnea, and I'm sure there'll be other pharmacologic therapeutics out there, so that the role of the sleep physician may be actually more complicated than it is now. Right now, everybody who has sleep apnea usually tries CPAP first. I mean, for the most part. But in the future, it may be, maybe you're a CPAP candidate. Maybe you're best treated with this drug or that drug, or get an Inspire implant or whatever. And I think that's where it's going.
I think the other thing, I just want to forget one thing. I think the other thing that'll change dramatically, as we have better technology to diagnose people, more and more primary care doctors are going to be responsible for the long-term care of these patients. There's no way in the world that all apnea patients are going to be monitored by apnea doctors on a chronic basis, or insomnia patients. So I think more of this will be done in general internal medicine and things like that in terms of long-term management.
Dr. Koloff, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we've been trying to get the primary care doctors interested for the last 50 years. So hopefully, I hope you're right. I think the one thing that kind of drives me crazy is how the AMA and the CPT codes, whatever, it's kind of held us back for so long, because polysomnography, to be honest, is not that much different from when it started. We haven't really advanced. It's crazy, and it's all because how much you get paid for it. And so I think, hopefully as the technology moves, this whole nomenclature, coding will advance, because I think it's really held us back. I mean, doing one night in a sleep lab, and then, predicting what's going to happen for the rest of the person's life sometimes is just not really practical. And I think that multi-night recordings with technology will really help advance, because I don't know about you, but some nights I sleep pretty good and some nights I don't. And we know there's a lot of night to night variability. And so I think not just diagnostic standpoint, but from a treatment standpoint, just being able to, monitor people for longer periods of time, with a thing like Tom says, like a watch. I mean, that makes it a lot easier. So we're going to learn a lot more. And I just hope that, I mean, one of the other issues is that there's, again, to Tom's point, there's no lack of business. There's so many. All our clinics are. And so how are we going to, move beyond like training 250 sleep doctors? We have to figure out how to get other people trained and able to at least take care of the most basic sleep.
Well, the field has been built on the shoulders of the people who came before us. So if you had somebody interested in the field, as maybe a medical student or a resident, what would you tell them? How, would you encourage them to go into it? How would you describe sort of the why they should do this?
My answer to that is virtually all sleep disorders in today, virtually all sleep disorders are treated symptomatically.
Mm.
We have no, we can sort of argue, the role of orexin 1 agonist in type 1 narcolepsy, but by and large, we're now dealing with, okay, so you can't breathe, we're going to blow a vacuum cleaner in your nose. You can't sleep, we're going to, slow your brain down. It's all symptomatic, RBD is treated by sedating drugs. I think the future is understanding the pathophysiology. I think where young people should be very excited is there's so much to learn.
Mm.
We're 50 years in, 50th anniversary, and we're still doing virtually 95 symptomatic treatment. So that's the future.
Well, picking up on that symptoms, I mean, that's why people come to see sleep doctors or anybody for their sleep. It's because they're experiencing some symptom related to their sleep. And I think the beauty of sleep medicine is that for most patients, you actually can make them feel better. And which is, personally for us, for sleep medicine physicians, that, physician satisfaction depends a little bit on, gratification that you actually have done something for someone. There are some fields where basically there are a lot of negative outcomes. And so in this field, actually, there's a lot of positive outcomes.
Dr. Collop?
Just to echo, I think a lot of there's so much more to learn. It's very exciting, so much new research coming out, and I would also say if the next generation is very tech oriented, and so the technology around sleep medicine, I think, would be very attractive for somebody of this generation, because it's only going to get better.
So I can say as a solo practitioner, I know I have concerns about decreasing reimbursement, right? Like you talked about for HSAT and PSG, and then the adoption of novel sleep technology. So I'm really glad to have a source like the AASM where I can go for guidance, and I appreciate, I think they also appreciate, like you've talked about, that you want to reflect sort of the needs of the members. So I'm glad that you all led the way to create this professional society that continues to grow. I think we can all agree it's not perfect, but I am grateful for all of your efforts to create it and how you continue to contribute to our field. So with that said, I would love to open this up for questions from our attendees. Please feel free to use the Q&A on Zoom. And so before we ask that one, I do want to ask Dr. Kwan, you had an interesting story about how the original site visits happened. So Dr. Roth, you kind of hinted at it. But
Yeah, so
what happened?
if a center wanted to become accredited by the AASM, originally, basically, the AASM sent out 2 people, and you would actually go there at night and watch a sleep study for part of the night. And then you'd come back the next morning and actually look at the sleep studies. And if they weren't very good, the sleep center would actually get dinged and may have trouble getting accredited. And you would quiz the technologists and ask them, what do you think about this tracing here? And you would ask the sleep physician, questions, and they had to submit case reports and about how they treated people. This obviously has evolved and went from 2 people eventually down to 1 person only showing up during the day, talking with people. And so how did you get people to do this? Well, the payment was dinner. So you got to show up. You got to show up at night, 2 people, and you got to go out to the best restaurant in town, so to speak, and have a nice dinner. Unfortunately, sometimes the sleep laboratories weren't in the greatest places, and so the quality of food was kind of questionable sometimes. But that's what the payment was.
And so the 2 site reviewers would go physically watch the setup, talk to the patient, talk to the tech.
Yeah.
Watch them score
I mean,
the next day?
The thing that was interesting is the minutiae were very interesting because you got to remember sleep centers were not a big thing. So like one of the things we're very interested in when we went there at night was signage. Can you find the sleep center?
Yeah, exactly.
90% of the centers, you go to somebody, so where's the sleep center? And they say, the what? So we're very interested in signage. I mean, because again, some sleep centers were not very common.
Something I bet that raises other concerns though, right? Because it's dark, it's maybe in an unsavory area. Like, what do you do for safety? And then is that a consideration for the patients and the techs? Is that something you would talk about?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Medical, and some of these places we're not in the main hospital. And what were the chances for, medical coverage?
There was a lot of debate about what constituted a center. I mean, did it have to be in the hospital, or could it be outside the hospital in an office building? And then the extension of the office building, could it be in a mobile home where you just trucked it around the state and stopped in one city one night and one city in the next night?
But didn't that used to be a thing in hotel rooms too?
Well, that was another variation. There were if you could think of a place to put a sleep lab, then somebody had an idea that if they thought they could make it a financial go of it, then they tried to do it. I mean, the other thing is, did you have to have a physician in charge of each lab, or could that person rotate to various places?
And how many could they?
Right.
Because they changed that not that long ago, right? Where it used to be capped and it had to be in person, and now it can be remote and whatever many labs, right?
The whole thing is evolved. I mean, originally, basically, you would also quiz the medical director about their interpretation of the sleep study, because in many cases, basically the tech knew more about sleep medicine than the physician did.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
See, wow. I was very lucky when I moved from University of Cincinnati, where we're in the hospital, to Henry Ford, from University of Cincinnati to Henry Ford Hospital. General Motors donated a Howard Johnson to the hospital.
Wow.
So I just got hotel rooms, which belonged to it became part of the hospital too. So my floors didn't get changed at all. So
that's amazing.
Howard Johnson beds.
So we have a question that popped up. As an undergraduate in neuroscience interested in sleep science and a long-term goal of educating youth and parents worldwide on developing early sleep hygiene and education, where should my focus be in furthering my education?
Perhaps that's for Tom.
It sounds like a Dr. Roth question.
I'm not quite sure there's a good answer to that. I think, unfortunately, at this point in time, I think it's pretty much left to your own initiatives. I mean, the advantage that you have today versus many years ago is there's got to be a sleep center near you, and they will help you. But in terms of being on curricula, not at all. You know, when my daughter, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago was in high school, you know, she had a you know, what do you call a hygiene book, you know, it was like 450 pages. And it was like 50 pages on depression and, you know, sexually transmitted disease. There's one page on sleep.
Oh
So,
my God.
so there's not a lot of education. So I think the advantage you have today, and we get this all the time, the Academy of Sleep Medicine actually runs contests for high school students
Mhm.
on this topic. So there's a lot more. What you got to do is go to ASM and you go to your local sleep center, and that's how you're going to get your best information. Much better than, unfortunately, your local institution.
There's another one here. As a 45-year-old coming from a background as a surgical technologist, health coach, and fireman/EMT, how can I personally help move sleep to the forefront and into the public eye? Once I graduate from polysomnographic technology, I wish I'd known about sleep medicine earlier in life.
Well, I think that you can be basically an advocate by speaking to all the people you know about the importance of sleep, and then actually, you know, with your knowledge, you can actually go and, you know, speak to small groups, you know, clubs that you belong to, your acquaintances, volunteer to speak at local organizations, and you will actually then increase the you know, the reach of your knowledge.
Yeah,
Both
I would also include like if you have kids, your kids' school or your neighborhood school is
Good
always
thought.
a good place they're always looking for outside speakers
Yep.
to improve
Well,
knowledge.
and social media, right? How many people are sleep influencers and sort of have a platform that they develop, and you know, I think there's a lot of ways to get information, you know, to disseminate information that doesn't require mailing it across the coast and, you know, retyping the entire thing. So I think social media is a big part of that too, I would imagine. How can sleep science be a part of school curriculum as a chapter in the science book and make it interesting from elementary school?
Well, it turns out that there are a lot of resources available actually for teachers for promulgating sleep science. And you can, teachers can avail themselves. I don't have the exact links right offhand, but they can avail themselves with short lessons, long lessons. In fact, actually, the National Center at one point actually published a sleep curriculum for high school students. But there are other sleep curriculums out there that can be accessed by teachers and can be made as part of their science curriculum.
If you go to NIH and go to National Center on Sleep Disorders Research, they actually have a curriculum there which is developed. It could be a little bit dated by now, but you know, that's the best way. That's a good way to start.
Well, thank you all for joining us today and sharing your stories of the AASM. While it's important to look back and see where we started from, I really do appreciate how you all can tie it into where we are now and where we might be in the next 50 years. So thank you to all of our panelists and attendees for joining today. For today's webinar, there will be an email sent out with instructions on how to view the webcast. I welcome you to view upcoming AASM and AASM Foundation webinars on current sleep medicine by visiting our event pages. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.